Welcome to the Disciple Making Leaders Podcast. I'm Mike Keaton, your host, and we're really glad that you're joining in with us today. I have the privilege to be joined today with Ken Adams, lead pastor of Crossroads Church and founder of Impact Ministries. And as always, Ken, it's a pleasure.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be on it, man. Absolutely. So, we love to talk about seeing the church be what God wanted it to be, and that is a movement of multiplying disciples. And so that's what really our heart beats for, right? And
Yep.
so it is good to be talking once again. We're kind of in a series right now on what does it mean to be a disciple-making pastor, and how do you become one, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit again today.
Yeah, great. Look forward to this conversation, and we are glad that you're going to be with us joining into this conversation today. So last time, Ken, we talked about how a disciple-making pastor really has to lead towards mission.
Correct.
And I remember one of the things that you really drew out pretty clear, it was that the mission itself is clear, and that we're all, a disciple-making pastor is to make sure that everybody is leading in the same direction.
Right.
But then also, another key distinction you gave was that we're leading in the right direction.
Yeah.
And so today, as we move towards the next part of becoming a disciple-making pastor, is leading themselves well.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's got to lead. It's got to start here.
Yeah. So before we dive into that, though, let me just kind of give the big picture again,
Sure.
and that is that one of the problems, if we look at the church and we understand that the mission of the church is to make disciples, then quite honestly, Mike, every pastor ought to be a disciple-making pastor. You and I both know they're not, and
Right.
So we really have a problem. We have a leadership problem in our church, and that is that we have leaders in some cases that are leading churches on a mission that they don't even know what it is. Now, how backwards is that, man? How messed up is that? And so it is fundamental that if Jesus stated the mission of the church to make disciples of all nations, then it's imperative that we figure out how to be disciple-making pastors. And part of the problem is that sometimes our theological training, as good as it is, it doesn't set us up very well for that.
That's correct.
And so sometimes we get less than desirable training. Sometimes we are led by models of pastors that are anything but disciple-making. Good guys, great preachers, great teachers, great shepherds, but that's not all that there is in the mission. It's part of it,
Right.
but that's not all of it. And so if we're going to figure out, if we're going to try to discover what does it mean to be a really good disciple-making pastor, the first thing we do is that we got to figure out who the model is, and that means we look to Jesus.
Right.
We go back and we look at what Jesus did, and there are a number of things that we see, but there's 6 things that just jump right off the pages of the Gospels. You know, one of the first things we see is that Jesus was leading toward mission. In other words, he was getting everybody going in the right direction, in the same direction. He was also leading himself first. He was exercising self-leadership. He wasn't asking anybody else to do what he wasn't doing. He was leading the movement. He was leading the movement, which in that case is the church. He was leading other leaders. He was leading with a plan, and he was leading well.
Right.
And so in this series, we're unpacking each one of those. In our last podcast, we talked about leading toward mission. Today, we want to talk about leading self first. And that really is what we call self-leadership. You know, Jesus even told his disciples in John chapter 20, verse 21, Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you, as the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." What a great example of Jesus basically saying, you know what, you can follow me because I've been, here with a mission. I've been doing what God sent me to do, what my Father sent me to do. And so really and truly, you just need to follow me. And so Jesus demonstrates, and Jesus is an example of what it means to have self-leadership. He really did lead himself before he ever asked anybody else to follow his lead. And so, as you think about that, it's kind of it's kind of hard to ask somebody to do what you're not doing yourself.
I heard somebody say one time, you can't lead somebody else any further than you are ahead of them.
Absolutely.
So you got to lead yourself first.
Yeah. And so if think about it like this, Mike. So if the goal is for us to be disciples and to build more disciples, then you have to be a disciple yourself, and you have to be building disciples yourself. So I think it's interesting that that there's a lot of pastors of churches today that maybe don't even know what it means, first of all, to be a disciple. What does that really look like? What does that really mean? And then what does it mean to build more disciples? And I do know that there's a lot of pastors, they mean well, they're great guys, they got good hearts, they're good leaders.
Right.
But they're not building more disciples. And that's the mission.
Yeah.
So we've got to figure out this whole idea of self-leadership. When Jesus exercised self-leadership, so it really boils down to two things. Is that Jesus modeled for his disciples who he wanted them to be and what he wanted them to do.
Right.
So it's a who and it's a what. Jesus literally did give them both of those, because he led himself, first of all, to be something,
right,
and then secondly, to do something.
And one flows into the other.
They do. They literally work together. So when you think about this idea of what does it mean to be a disciple, or to focus on the who we're supposed to be, really that comes back to what we would call the character of Christ.
Right.
And so, you know what? Think about this, Mike. Before Jesus ever did a miracle, before Jesus ever preached a sermon, before Jesus ever, asked anybody to join him in community, before Jesus did a single action or deed or behavior, before he did something, he was something.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what he was. So Jesus was, if you look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, Jesus was the perfect model of what it meant to live the character that we needed to live. And so Paul tells us the fruit of the Spirit is what? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control.
Right.
So what Jesus did is that Jesus didn't ask anybody to become something that he wasn't first modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing he does is that he models his character. The second thing he does is that he models his conduct. Mm. And so conduct is what you do. So it's who you are and what you do.
Right.
And so Jesus lived a lifestyle of what it meant to be a disciple and build more disciples. And so there's a number of things that he did. One of the things that we see is that Jesus was committed to the mission. He was really a member of the mission. Jesus was caring for others. He was a minister. He was glorifying the Father. He was a worshiper. He was magnifying God. He was maturing. Jesus quoting Scripture, man.
Right.
Jesus was taking time away to pray. He's modeling all these things,
right,
that he wanted his disciples to do. Mm-hmm. He was clearly a messenger and a good manager of his life and his resources, and Jesus was a multiplier. And so what we could say is that Jesus was a fully trained disciple, and he's calling his disciples to become fully trained. So, the beauty of this thing, Mike, is that Jesus wasn't asking anybody to be or do what he wasn't being or doing.
Yeah, that's so good. It's as guys, and I'm going to speak from a guy's point of view. I know there's ladies out there as well who are disciple makers and so forth, but a lot of us have a tendency to we want to focus on the doing. Let's get busy. Okay, what do we got to do? Tell me what I got to do. We really do have to focus on the being and the doing.
Yeah.
The who and the what.
Yeah.
They go together. So.
Yeah, and so I think a couple of really big questions that we need to ask ourselves. I think first of all is that we need to ask the question, so am I leading myself first? Mm-hmm. Am I demonstrating self-leadership? Think about this, is that there was anybody here on this planet that was telling Jesus or holding Jesus accountable mm-hmm. for serving others, for sharing the message.
That's a powerful truth.
Yeah, nobody was holding Jesus accountable for his time alone with the Father. Nobody was holding Jesus accountable. Jesus clearly demonstrated self-leadership. He led himself first.
Right.
And so we have to follow that same example and lead ourselves first. Mm-hmm. And, I'm surrounded by a lot of really great leaders, and I have some elders in our church and some people that really are good at holding me accountable. But quite honestly, is that I have to demonstrate self-leadership and self-accountability before, because really and truly, none of those people are going to ask me some of the things mm-hmm. that I need about my character
right.
and about my conduct.
It's good.
And so Jesus becomes really the measuring stick for how we go about doing self-leadership.
Yeah. So you mentioned maybe a couple questions. What was the other one?
Well, the other question would be, am I demonstrating the character of Christ in my life? And am I demonstrating the conduct of Christ in my life?
Gotcha.
30 years ago, I left seminary where somebody was telling me what to do, where to go, when to show up, and all those kinds of things. And I came to plant a new church. And what's funny is that there was nobody telling me where to go, what to do, when to do it. I was just figuring it out on my own, and I wasn't leading myself very well. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was leading myself so poorly that I was kind of all over the map, kind of all over the rails, and wasn't really having good quality time with God, wasn't really, spending good time with my wife. I was not doing a good job of preparing messages. It was just wasn't taking care of my body. There was so many things I wasn't leading myself well. And through a series of events, God really got a hold of me, got my attention, and said, you know what, you can't lead anybody else in this church to where you're not going yourself. And so I really did come to a point where I realized I needed to lead myself first before I could lead. I couldn't be a disciple-making pastor if I weren't first, being a disciple and
right.
building disciples. So it was a huge turning point for me. And so, as a result of that, I have, 30 years later, we are trying to create some learning opportunities to help pastors become disciple-making pastors. And so we have a group that people can join. It's called a disciple-making pastors group. And so you can go to impactdisciples.com to get more information about that. You can become a part of a group that meets over a period of about 6 months. And we do all that online. You've been a part of that. Yep. You know how that works.
It's great. Yeah, definitely would encourage our viewers to be a part of that and to jump in on those. And, Ken, one of the passages that kind of speaks to this as well for us, for all of us, moving outside the generations from Christ, is Paul's passage in 1 Corinthians 11:1, where he says, follow me as I follow Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Yeah. And so that really speaks to this whole deal.
It does.
And we really want to help you to become these disciple-making pastors so that you can say that and can be that example. And these equipping groups are the prime opportunity for that. And so these are getting cranked up, and we want to encourage you to go to the website and sign up for that, inquire how you can be a part of that, and we'd love to get together with you and get you going in that right there. Yeah. So thanks for joining us today, and our prayer is that you will become a disciple-making pastor, that you will lead toward mission, and start by leading yourself well. Thanks for joining in with us today. We look forward to seeing you next time.